Welcome to the Washington Week Extra. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Next week, the Select Committee investigating the January 6th Capitol attack will begin public hearings. That's right, public hearings. Here's what we know so far. The committee's first public hearing will start at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, June 9th. Everybody in D.C. has marked their calendars. It's expected to last 90 minutes to 2 hours. A statement released by the committee said it will share, quote, previously unseen material. For the last 11 months, the committee has been investigating the attack on the Capitol. And during that time, they've spoken to nearly 1,000 witnesses, including a number of former White House aides, as well as former President Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. The committee is looking into 5 areas related to the January 6th attack: efforts by former President Trump and close associates to pressure federal, state, and local officials to overturn the election, law enforcement and intelligence agency failures, domestic extremist groups, QAnon and online misinformation, January 6th rally planners and the Stop the Steal movement, and following the money behind efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Joining me tonight to discuss what to expect and more, Eugene Daniels, playbook author and White House correspondent for Politico, and Annie Carney, congressional reporter for the New York Times. Well, Annie, I want to start with you because there's a little bit of breaking news tonight, and that is that the Department of Justice is not going to charge Mark Meadows, who was the final chief of staff for former President Trump, as well as Dan Scavino, who is deputy chief of staff. That is coming as Peter Navarro, a White House advisor, was charged with contempt, indicted on contempt of Congress because he is not even negotiating with the January 6th investigation. We also saw Steve Bannon face charges for not cooperating. Talk a little bit about what this news means and the significance of it.
I mean, I think that the difference here with the players you just mentioned is none of them wanted to cooperate. Meadows hasn't cooperated, but there has been hours of negotiations behind the scenes with the committee. They've engaged with the committee, as we've seen in many news stories about his texts on that day. I think they've turned over a lot of stuff. Navarro and Bannon have refused to even negotiate. So I think that's that's breaking news, but I think that's where we're seeing the breakdown of who's being charged and who's not being charged. We are going to find out, a detailed play-by-play of what went on that day, starting next week at the hearings. And I think that, 6 televised hearings, this is an opportunity, I don't know if it will work, for the Democrats to kind of bring back the fear and the horror that people felt in the days after January 6th, and that even, Kevin McCarthy felt, as we know from the tapes, in those days after January 6th. We all have a short attention spans, and there's a lot going on. But this is the Democrats' opportunity to really lay out blow by blow what happened, why it matters, and why you should, this should be one of the top issues you vote on in November. That's a hard task for them to.
What specifically will you be looking out for? What are you looking for as a reporter who's obviously covering the Hill every day in, day out, watching these lawmakers do the work?
The facts are going to speak for themselves. I think we're going to hear a timeline of what happened that day that we don't fully know right now. And I'm looking from like a political perspective. I'm covering the midterms. I'm looking to see if these televised hearings kind of drive this issue, bring this issue to the forefront when, as we've been just discussing, inflation, baby formula, other day-to-day issues are what people are feeling horrible about. Shootings. I mean, the being able to tell people that democracy in peril should be one of their wake up in the morning or stay up at night worried about. It's a little more theoretical, except on and this is their chance to say it's really not. That Republicans are trying to take away your vote. That is something that Democrats have polled that really matters to people, but it fades. And so this is their chance to say, this is what's at stake, and lay it out nice and clear, so we understand that the violence of that day was, one part of a plot to, undermine the election, and that is I'm very curious to see how they underscore the seriousness of what happened and make it matter to people.
And Eugene, same question. What are you looking for when it comes to these public hearings? They've been much anticipated. What are you going to be looking at?
I think what's key, in addition to everything Annie said, will this committee be able to kind counteract all of the whitewashing that we've seen happening in right-wing media, happening with Republicans on the Hill and around the country about what happened that day, right? Because for about a year and a half, they have been able to say kind of whatever they want, kind of trying to tell us and convince the American people that what we're looking at on the screen wasn't that bad, that it wasn't that scary, when we know that's not true. People died. And so that's part one. But also what former President Trump was doing that day. There's a lot of things that we think we know about what he did, because a lot of it was happening publicly when he still had his Twitter account. But there's so much, I think, that we don't know. We know that the National Archives is possibly allowing them to get official White House photographs. So that tells you where the president was and what he was doing. And also from the morning, the time that he woke up and knew that he was going to the lips to make that speech, to when we saw him do that kind of hostage video telling people to go home, but that he loved them. What was happening between that? Because that's what folks want to know, and that's what the American people want to know. What did the then president do? And more importantly, was he pushing folks to continue what was happening that day?
And there is this black box basically at the White House where we don't really know what the president was doing. I remember standing on the lawn and reporting, yes, we know he's watching TV, we know he's enjoying at least part of this, but we don't really know the conversations that he's having. So it's gonna be really interesting. I wanna stick with you, Eugene, because we've seen so many big hearings in the last couple of years. I mean, James Comey probably took them all, right? The former FBI director sitting in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee. But I wonder, what's the likelihood that this breaks through? What's the likelihood that what we think is really important in Washington, is actually going to be important to my cousins in Miami and other places who have real life issues to deal with? As Annie said, the economy, people are trying to find baby formula. How much do you think this might break through?
Or my family in Bucksport, South Carolina, right? We're trying to figure out whether or not this is something they can convince the American people to care about this, because we remember that day, right? We had friends who possibly were there, that were there while this was happening. And so the American people watched in horror, but they have largely moved on. And talking to the American people about, democracy is in peril, that's not something that counteracts, what kind of food am I able to bring on my table? How much is gas? How can I possibly go to work? Whether or not I have a job and if I like that job, right? The fact that we're still in the middle of a pandemic, that killed more than 1 million people in this country. And so this is going to be a test of whether or not they can convince folks to care. And I will say, based on the evidence that we've seen in other hearings, that it's going to be really difficult and probably not going to happen. And that's really depressing for those of us that really care about democracy and are worried about what January 6th portends for the future. Because if there's no blowback, especially legally or politically, for the folks that were involved at the highest levels of government to try to overturn the will of the people in this country, what does that say for the next time they want to do that, especially now that there's more of a blueprint? And obviously, the Republican Party is not going to you're not going to get in any flack and in trouble for it. So that's something that I think the folks on this committee are really trying to work through, but it's going to be really difficult.
And Annie, last question. I wonder, when you think about covering the midterms, when you think about sort of what January 6th portends for the future, how much are lawmakers sort of trying to make that connection, and how much are they maybe saying, we're not going to be able to make it? These public hearings are in June, the election's not till November. So much can happen between when these hearings happen and when people go to the ballot.
Absolutely. I mean, so far, democracy in peril is not what frontline Democrats are talking about in their races. They're talking about inflation and baby formula, and they're trying to show that they were the ones pushing Biden to have a stronger response. And they are trying to show that they care about the kitchen table issues. And yes, and June is very far from November. So I don't know if it's going to last, but this is the month, as I said earlier, this is the month where a few things can help them frame this election, not just as a referendum, an up or down vote on are you happy with Democrats in power, but this is a way to say, it's a choice between people who want to protect democracy and a party that wanted to undermine your election and your vote. This is a choice on abortion, and, a bunch of issues, but this is one of them that it's going to be a real contrast.
Yeah, and Annie, I should say, I mean, for our viewers, Annie during the show talked about abortion, guns, January 6th, and the economy all happening in June. It's such a smart way to frame it, because those are all the things that are going to be happening. We'll have to leave it there. tonight. But thank you so much to Eugene and to Annie for joining us and for sharing your reporting. Good night from Washington. I'm Yamiche Alcindor.